A girl of 17 knelt in the dark of a mountain cave, her hands cracked and bleeding, pressing her palm flat against a floor of cold stone, waiting for warmth that would not come. Outside, the wind was beginning to change, the kind of change that runs ahead of something terrible. And 2 miles down the slope, in a warm hotel dining room, powerful men had already decided that she and her dying mother did not belong to their town. They had handed her a patch of worthless ground and called it charity. They expected the cold to do the rest. But her father had left her something. Folded thin in the seam of an old leather book, a drawing, a secret about stone and patience and fire that burns downward instead of up. She had 1 week to finish. The mountain had other plans, and when the white came roaring down off the ridge, every door in that valley would close, except one. The mountains did not care about the town beneath them. They never had. They stood the way they had always stood, vast, silent, indifferent. Their highest ridges already wore the season's first white. Their old faces turned toward a sky that offered nothing warm, and at their feet the little town sat like something a man had scratched into the base of something that could not be moved. A small argument against the patience of stone, raw timber buildings, a church steeple no one had painted yet, a main street of packed mud that froze hard each night and turned to soft treachery by afternoon. It was a place still in the middle of becoming itself, and like every such place, it had already decided, quietly, without ever saying so out loud, who belonged to it and who did not. A widow and her daughter stood on the wooden step outside the town hall, in a wind that had teeth. The girl did not sit, though the step was wide enough for two. She stood with her father's coat draped over her shoulders, the sleeves taken up 2 inches by her mother's careful stitching. Her hands were folded in front of her, and she watched the closed door with the particular stillness of someone who already understood that whatever was being decided behind it was finished. Her name was Marin Hale. She was 17 years old. She had her father's way of standing in front of things she could not change, upright, quiet, wholly present, as though presence itself were a kind of dignity no one could take from her by paperwork. Beside her sat Ruth Hale, her shawl pulled tight, her breath making small white shapes in the cold. Ruth was 42 and looked older, the way that country aged a person faster than years alone could manage. A cough had been her companion through 2 long winters. It rose in her throat now, and she pressed her lips together and pushed it back down. Not here. Not in front of this door. Whatever the men inside were deciding, they would not get to do it to the sound of her losing ground. The meeting had been going on for the better part of an hour. It would not go on much longer. The men inside were not deliberating. They were rehearsing, practicing the delivery of a thing that had already been decided 3 nights before, over a supper one man had paid for, and the others had eaten without ever asking why he was paying. Some arrangements do not need to be spoken to work. Then the door opened. Harlan Voss filled the frame with the ease of a man unused to being questioned in his own doorway. He was 55. He had come to this valley years ago with 2 mules and a letter of credit, and he had turned both into something considerable. The largest cattle operation, a share of the mine on the western slope, half the buildings on the street, including the hotel, where the real decisions were always made, over meals other men never had to pay for. He had decided, somewhere in his younger years, that prosperity was the only virtue worth keeping without interruption. And he wore that decision the way some men wear faith, as a constant, unspoken reminder of where everyone else stood by comparison. He looked at Ruth first, then at Maren. And his face held that particular mixture of pity and satisfaction that belongs to people who have confused being efficient with being good. The council had reviewed their situation, he said, the unpaid rent, the coming winter, the needs of the town. He let each point settle. The way a man pauses when he has learned that silence after a statement makes the statement feel like gravity instead of opinion. Then he reached inside his coat and drew out a folded paper. The council, he said, was not without charity. He held it out the way a man holds out something he wants to seem generous in giving away. Ruth reached for it, and then Voss said the thing that had not been planned, the thing that rose in him from some place where his real feelings about this family lived, separate from his careful arithmetic. He said her husband had been a good man. A shame. He said the man had not managed to leave his family anything but debts. Ruth's hands stopped on the paper. The words had not been aimed at Maren. They had been aimed, with care, at the woman who had loved Samuel Hale for the better part of her life, who had buried him in ground that was barely thawed, who had sat beside him through 2 winters of careful accounting, and had never once said aloud what they both already knew was coming. Voss knew where to aim. He always had. Maren's hand moved. It was the smallest thing, the lightest pressure against her mother's sleeve. Barely a touch at all. Ruth looked at her daughter, and something passed between them in that half a second. Ruth had the words ready. She had carried them since she understood what this meeting was, what it had always been going to be. She wanted to say one true thing about Samuel Hale. Something that would cost this man the comfort of his own story. But Maren's hand said, "No, not with force." With the quiet certainty of a person who understood that words, right now, were a coin they could not afford to spend. Ruth held the sound inside her chest, and the cost of holding it showed on her face. Voss saw it, and the seeing of it settled something in him that looked a great deal like satisfaction. Ruth took the paper. She unfolded it slowly, her eyes moving across the lines with the careful effort of a woman whose mind was resisting what it read. The land sat at the eastern edge of the valley, 3 acres, free and clear. Everyone knew that ground. They called it the Cold Mouth because its only feature was a dark opening in a north-facing wall of rock, a cave the children dared each other to enter on slow summer afternoons. The slope above was loose scree and stubborn juniper, no timber worth cutting, no soil worth turning, no water but the violent spring runoff that tore down the hill each year and went to waste in the gully below. The nearest cabin sat 2 miles off. This was not a gift. Every person standing there understood it was not a gift. It was a removal, dressed in the language of generosity, and it had been done with the kind of paperwork that makes throwing someone out look like mercy. Maren took the deed from her mother's hands. She read it the way her father had taught her to read anything, line by line, no skipping, no assuming she already knew where it was going. And near the bottom, in the densest block of legal language on the page, she found a clause about mineral rights. She read it twice, Then she folded the deed along its old creases and placed it inside her father's coat, close against her chest. She looked at Voss. "We thank you." 3 words. Nothing more. No performance of gratitude. No trembling for him to measure himself against. She put her arm around her mother's shoulders, and together they walked down off that step and out into the cold, away from the door, and the man standing in it, watching them go. And the satisfaction on his face shifted, just slightly, into something less comfortable. He looked down at the copy of the deed in his own hand. He thought for a moment about the clause near the bottom, the one about minerals, the one he had signed without pausing over, because the land was worthless, and no man reads carefully the small print of a thing he is certain has no value. He folded the paper and put it away, and went back inside. At the corner of the street, where the shadow of a half-built office fell across the frozen mud, a man stood with his back to the wall and his collar turned up. Deputy Boone. He was broad through the chest, near 40, with the still patience of a man used to watching without being watched. He watched the 2 women until they turned the corner and were gone. Then Voss appeared in the doorway behind him and looked at him. A single nod, nothing more, lasting perhaps 2 seconds. No words crossed the distance between them. Boone took a small notebook from his breast pocket and wrote something in it and put it away. Neither woman saw it. Neither woman looked back. The walk home took the better part of an hour. They did not speak. Ruth kept her hand in the crook of her daughter's arm, and Marin walked at a pace that was neither hurried nor slow, simply the pace of 2 people covering ground together. Inside, Marin made tea. She fed the iron stove, and she sat across from her mother, and did not say anything that would have been easier to say than to carry. After a while, Ruth said she did not know how they would manage it. Marin said they would figure it out, not as comfort, as the plain truth, as she understood it. Because somewhere beneath the level where fear did its work, she had already begun to see the faint outline of a thing. That night, after her mother slept, Marin sat alone with a single candle and a small wooden box. It had come home from the mine with her father's other things. Inside were a few rock samples wrapped in cloth, a compass with a cracked lens, and a journal bound in dark leather. Samuel Hale had gone underground as a boy, and unlike most, he had not merely endured it. He had been drawn to it, the way some people are drawn to music or to numbers. He read stone the way other men read newspapers, carefully, listening for what it was actually saying, instead of what he hoped it would say. He had not found wealth in those mountains. He had found a wife with a directness of gaze that unsettled him, and then would not let him go. He had found a daughter who took his stillness and her mother's clarity and made something of her own out of the 2. And in the last years before the shaft took him, he had found a kind of quiet contentment, written down in plain and unhurried sentences in a small, dark book. He had not lived to be old, but he had left behind in that book more than most men gather in twice the years. Marin turned the pages slowly by candlelight, and then her fingers stopped. A length of red thread had been wound twice around the journal, marking one single page. She had not put it there. He had. In 4 years of reading those pages, she had never once arrived at this one. She opened to the marked place, and the candle flame leaned and held. The page held a survey notation, a line of coordinates, then a brief description in her father's clipped shorthand, and below that, a diagram. It was small, no more than a few square inches on the page, but it was precise, and it was deliberate. A firebox at one end, a long, gently sloping channel running beneath a floor lined with flat stone, and far away, at the other end, a vertical stack. The smoke did not go up. That was the strange thing. That was the thing that made her lean closer to the candle. The smoke went down and forward, pulled through 40 feet of buried stone, heating the channel, heating the floor above it, heating the very mass of the earth and rock, until the mountain itself became a slow, patient radiator, returning warmth from the inside out. Beside the channel, figures for the way heat moves through old stone. Beside the stack, notes on the draw, based not on the height of a chimney, but on the difference in temperature between one end and the other. And at the bottom, in letters slightly larger than the rest, her father had written, "The rock is a miser. Teach the smoke to pay for its passage, and the mountain will become the furnace." And beneath that, in a steadier hand, "This place could shelter a family through any winter this country can produce." Marin set the journal down. She looked at the deed on the table beside it. She looked at the diagram. And then she turned the page. She had never turned the page. The red thread had always stopped her at the drawing, and she had always assumed the marked page was the whole of what he meant her to find. But there was more. A single line written in the same hand, but smaller. The ink a little different. As though he had set the pen down and then picked it back up. The tree fights the wind and breaks. The mountain does not fight the cold. It absorbs it and remembers. Be the mountain. And beneath that, folded so thin it had nearly hidden in the seam of the binding, was a letter. Marin unfolded it with the care of a person handling something that might come apart in her hands. It was not long. Her father wrote that a man had come to him about this design, a man with money and a way of speaking that turned every kindness into an arrangement. The man had wanted to own it, all of it, to be the only one in the valley who could keep a house warm through the cold months, and to charge whatever the cold would let him charge. Samuel Hale had said no. He wrote that warmth was not a thing one man should be allowed to hold over others, that the stone had been here long before any of them and would be here long after, and that the day a person had to beg another person for the right to be warm was the day something had gone wrong that no amount of money could set right. He did not name the man. He did not have to. Marin read it 3 times. Then she folded the letter back along its thin creases and slid it inside the journal, behind the marked page, where it had waited 4 years for her to find it. The candle had burned low. Outside, the wind pressed against the cabin walls with a low, searching sound. She was 17 years old. The world had handed her what it intended as a quiet sentence, written on paper, delivered with a show of charity, and she sat there in the failing light, and understood, in the slow way that real understanding arrives, that it was something else entirely. She did not sleep much. The next morning was sharp and clear. The sky was that hard, particular blue that comes before deep cold. Frost burned white on every surface the early sun touched, Maren walked the 2 miles to the eastern edge alone. Her mother was resting. The climb up the loose slope had moved, over the last several months, into the category of things Ruth's body would no longer do without a cost neither of them could afford. The path left the settled part of the valley quickly. Within half a mile, the sounds of the town fell away. Within a mile, there was only the wind, and the juniper, and the far-off complaint of a hawk working the air above the ridge. She found the cave, and she stood in front of it and took it apart with her father's eyes, the way he had taught her to look at any opening in the earth, not to be impressed by it, not to be frightened of it, but to read it. The entrance faced north. A north-facing mouth got no direct sun, which meant no harsh swing between hot and cold to stress the stone. The rock was old, some of the oldest, most stable stone on the whole continent. The slope above ran steeply up before leveling at the ridge, and the wind came across the shoulder of rock to the left, which meant no drift would ever pile directly against the opening. The mountain's shape had been arranging for this, without anyone's permission, for longer than the idea of shelter had even existed. She pushed aside the brittle scrub and stepped through. And inside, the wind cut out entirely. The temperature dropped a few degrees, but differently. Not the dry, moving cold of open air. Something stiller, older. The smell was of wet stone and deep earth, and time measured in amounts that made a human life feel brief. She sat down on a flat rock near the entrance, and she closed her eyes. And she did what her father had taught her to do in any space below the surface. She listened, not for sounds, though there were sounds, the faint creak and settle of stone, the whisper of air through some unseen crack, a drip of water somewhere, finding its way to somewhere else. She listened past the sounds, to the quality of the silence underneath them, to the way the mountain breathed. Most people were never quiet enough to hear it. Maren sat and listened for a long time, and when she finally rose and walked back out into the hard light, she did not feel that she had made a decision. A decision means a choice, and she understood by then that there was no choice. There was only the thing to be done, and the question of whether she could do it. She did not get far down the slope before she found out she was not alone. A man stood on the path below her. His horse was tied to a juniper 20 feet back. His hands hung loose at his sides, in the way of a man who wants to seem casual, but has chosen his spot too carefully for the seeming to hold. Deputy Boone. He said he was checking the boundary line. He said Mr. Voss sent his regards. That Mr. Voss was concerned about her welfare, and her mother's, given the season. He said there was a storage building behind the livery that sat empty through the cold months. Well built. A stove already in it. Nothing fancy, he said, but it would keep 2 people alive. Maren looked at him. She said that was very kind of Mr. Voss, to think of them. She said she would keep it in mind. And she walked past him, down the slope. He did not follow. But at the edge of her hearing, she caught the small sound of a notebook opening. Neither thing was an accident. A man does not climb 2 miles of frozen scree to repeat an offer of charity, and a man does not write down the answer to a kindness, unless the kindness was never the point. The dry goods store sat at the south end of the street, in a building that smelled permanently of coffee and pine resin and the dusty sweetness of things stored through many seasons. The woman who ran it was named Cora. She was somewhere past 50, with white hair pinned close to her head and hands that had been rough for 30 years and showed no sign of softening. She had outlasted a husband, 2 business partners, and 4 separate attempts by Harlan Voss to buy her building out from under her. She wore the history of each of those survivals in the set of her jaw. When Marin came through the door, Cora looked at her the way she looked at very few people, without softening, without the faint condescension of sympathy. She looked at her the way you look at a person you intend to treat as an equal. She waited until the last customer had gone. Then she came around the counter and drew Marin into the space between the shelves at the back and spoke in a low voice, meant for the conversation and not for being overheard. What she said took only a few minutes to say. Voss had bought the note on the cabin months ago, before the final payment ever came due. The whole thing, the council, the charity, the worthless land. It had not been decided in any meeting. It had been decided by one man over a quiet supper and handed to the others as a thing requiring their agreement, not their thought. And the land at the eastern edge had not been chosen by accident. Marin went very still. Cora told her the rest. Voss needed the old cabin gone. Not the cabin itself, the ground it sat on. He was opening a new way up to the mine, and the cheap route ran straight through the Hale land. The expensive route would cost him 2 months and more money than he cared to spend. Moving 2 women off that ground was not a side effect of his plan. It was the plan. Marin asked quietly, "Who knew this?" Cora said, "Everyone, and no one will say it." Marin was silent a moment. Then she asked the only question that mattered. Why was Cora saying it? The older woman looked down at her own hands on the counter, at the calluses in their specific places, and she said her husband had been a miner too, that he had also died underground. Not here, somewhere else, in a place whose name she still could not say without effort. She said she could not do what she wished she could do, but she could do this, and she reached under the counter and brought out a wrapped package. A tin of lamp oil, a coil of good rope, the kind that holds its shape in the cold. She set it down without ceremony. Marin picked it up, and she looked at Cora for a moment with an expression that was not quite gratitude. Something more considered than that. An understanding between 2 women that some kinds of help are offered at a cost the giver has already counted. 2 days later, the work began. It started with the floor. The cave floor was loose rock and old debris settled over centuries, and it did not want to leave. Marin carried it out by hand, stone by stone, building a level surface over 3 days that left her fingers split and her back conducting a long, private argument about the limits of what a body will do without complaint. On the second morning, her mother appeared at the entrance. Ruth stood there with her shawl over her coat, and her chin set in the particular way that meant she had already decided and was not interested in the arguments Marin had prepared. So they worked side by side. They heated water for their hands each evening, and said little about the pain, saying it would not have changed it. There was a rhythm to it that surprised them both. 2 people who had spent a season carefully not speaking about the thing that was coming for them now had a thing to do with their hands instead. And the work, hard as it was a kind of mercy. It gave the grief somewhere to go. On the 4th day, Marin laid out the trench with rope and 4 wooden stakes. The ground inside the cave was packed earth over bedded rock, and it did not yield without a fight. Every inch was a negotiation between the steel head of her father's pickaxe and the stubborn memory of the earth. She worked from first light until the light failed, and that afternoon, she found the hoof prints. They circled the area outside the cave mouth and then went back down the slope. 2 days old at least, the edges softened by wind. Someone had ridden up and stood for a time, at a distance, and then ridden back down, without ever coming close. The prints were not Boone's horse. She had noted his on the path. These were smaller, more careful in their spacing. Someone had come to look, and had chosen not to be seen looking. She stood and looked down the 2 miles of slope toward the thin smoke of the town's chimneys. She did not know who had come. She knew only that someone down there was paying attention, and attention in that valley, in that season, was rarely a neutral thing. She picked up the pickaxe and went back to work. It was the next evening that the first real trouble came. She had left her tools just inside the entrance, covered against the frost. The copied diagram, the one she had redrawn larger, in her own hand, with the cave's true measurements. She had waited under a flat stone on the firebox base. In the morning, the stone had been moved, and the diagram was gone, not blown away. The cave was sheltered. Nothing blew away in there. Torn. She found pieces of it caught in the scrub outside, fluttering like pale moths against the juniper. Whoever had done it had not even bothered to take it far. They had wanted her to find the pieces. They had wanted her to understand that someone could reach this place, in the dark, while she slept 2 miles away, and undo a night's work, and leave again, and never be seen. It was a small cruelty, and a clever one, because the diagram was the thing. The diagram was weeks of her father's thinking, made plain. Lose it, and lose the spine of the whole undertaking. Marin stood in the cold mouth of the cave, holding the torn pieces in her palm. And then she did something that surprised even her. She did not panic. She did not grieve the loss. She went inside and sat down on the flat rock by the entrance, and she closed her eyes, and she drew the whole thing again. From memory, every channel, every measurement, every figure for the way heat moves through old stone, because the diagram had never really been on the paper at all. She had read it so many times, by so many candles, that it had moved off the page and into the place where a person keeps the things they cannot afford to lose. You cannot tear that up. You cannot reach it in the dark while someone sleeps. When she finished, she folded the new drawing and slid it inside her father's coat, next to the deed and the journal, where it would stay. She did not mention the torn diagram to her mother. Some weights are lighter when only one person carries them, but that night, lying awake, she let herself think about the smaller hoof prints, and the torn paper, and the way the two things fit together like a hand into a glove. Someone had come to look, and then someone had come to take. And both visits had been made by a person who did not want to be seen. She did not let it frighten her. She let it teach her something instead. That what she was building was no longer a small thing one girl did on worthless ground. It had become a thing worth watching, a thing worth stopping. And a thing is only worth stopping when someone, somewhere, has begun to suspect that it might actually work. 3 days after that, on a gray afternoon, with the first real cold pressing down from the ridge, she heard a horse on the slope. The man who dismounted was broad and deliberate. His hands bore the permanent stain of pine resin. His face had been weathered into a kind of constant, slight frown. Not displeasure, exactly. The expression of a man who has spent so long solving problems that he has begun to see everything as a problem waiting for one. Jonah Reed. He had built nearly every cabin in that valley. He had raised the frames of the church and the town hall. By any honest measure, he was the most skilled builder in the country around, and he knew it. And 20 years of being right about the way things hold up had hardened that knowing into something very close to certainty. He watched her work for a long moment before he spoke. She kept on without looking up, setting a capstone into the channel lining, bedding it in clay, checking the joint with her fingers. He had come to see how they were getting on, he said. There was real kindness in it. And underneath the kindness, the faint condescension of a man who has already decided the answer. He had lumber at his mill, he said. Not much, but enough for a small lean-to against the south face of the rock. A proper fireplace, a low roof. It would keep 2 people alive through the cold months. It would take a great deal of wood, but it was survivable. He had built under worse. Myron set down her trowel. The movement was unhurried. The way a person shifts from one kind of attention to another. She told him that was generous, and she meant it. A pause settled between them. Then she said, "But the ground won't steal the heat. It will hold it." Jonah looked at her. The way experienced men look at the young when they have said something just plausible enough to be worth answering, and almost certainly wrong. He was patient about it. He explained the trouble as he understood it. Thermal mass was real, he said. He did not dispute that, but it worked both ways. Cold ground would drink the warmth out of any fire built near it, just as readily as it would later give that warmth back. To bring all that stone up to a useful heat would take more fuel than they had any hope of gathering before the heavy snows. They would be pouring warmth into the mountain for weeks before the mountain gave a thing back, and by then, they would have burned through everything they had. He was not wrong. That was the difficult part. What he said was not wrong, as far as it went. Myron reached into her father's coat and drew out the journal. She did not explain it. She did not preface it. She opened it to the marked page, the red thread still wound around the cover, and held it out to him. And from her other hand, she produced the redrawn diagram, the one she had made twice now. Once on paper and once out of the place no one could tear. Jonah took the journal. He looked at the handwriting, at the sketch, at the figures running down the margin beside the channel. He looked at her copy, at the measurements, at the way she had fitted her father's design to the true dimensions of this particular cave on this particular slope. He studied the numbers for the way heat would travel the full length of the buried channel. He read the notes on draw and draft, based not on the height of a chimney, but on the difference in temperature between one end and the other. The frown deepened, and his voice, when it came, was quiet, almost against his will. "This is engineering. It is not theory," Myron said. "It is what the rock will do, when you ask it correctly." Jonah was silent for a long moment. He could not fault the physics. The mass was real. The transfer was real. The mathematics of the draw were sound. What he could not accept, and this was no longer about physics, was that a 17-year-old girl, in a matter of weeks, with no equipment and almost no materials, could build a thing this precise, could hold the tolerances, could seal 40 feet of channel so that not a wisp of smoke escaped where it should not. His voice took on a careful flatness. The execution would not match the theory, he said. The joints would leak. The draw would wander. The firebox would crack under the strain of heating and cooling, over and over, through a long winter. She met his eyes. Without defensiveness, without the heat he might have half expected. "I know every place it might fail," she said. "I have been studying my father's notes. Those are the same problems he found." He wrote the answers down next to them. Jonah handed the journal back, and he stood for a long moment, looking at the trench and the cave, and this girl with her cracked hands and a steadiness in her eyes that was not the steadiness of arrogance. It was something older, quieter, the look of a person who has understood the full weight of what she is attempting and has decided to attempt it anyway. He shook his head, not with anger, with something more complicated than that. "I hope you know what you're doing." She picked up her trowel and went back to work. He turned to go. His horse was 20 feet off. He had walked maybe 15 of those feet. When he stopped, he stood with his back to the cave a moment, and then he turned around. He said he had known Samuel Hale. Not well, but enough to know the man did not leave things behind by accident. He looked at the red thread, still visible at the edge of the journal in her coat. "He tied that," Jonah said, "before he died, didn't he?" It was not quite a question. Maren said nothing. Jonah nodded as though she had answered, and he walked to his horse and mounted and rode back down the slope, slowly, the way a man rides when he is working on a problem that does not yet have a shape. It was 2 days later that the boy came. She heard the footsteps stop just outside the entrance. Not a horse. Too light, too deliberate. She did not pause her work, and a voice said, "My father says you'll be dead before the snow's gone." She turned. A boy stood at the edge of the cave mouth, 14 years old, slight, with Jonah Reed's broad forehead and something in his eyes that was entirely his own. A quick, hungry intelligence that had not yet found the thing it was meant for. He was looking at the wall she had begun, at the floor, at the firebox taking shape, with the focused attention of someone who had come with one purpose and was already, quietly, revising whether that purpose still fit what he was seeing. His name was Ren Reed. Maren set down her hammer. She considered his words with the same direct attention she gave to everything. And then she said, "Come inside and tell me what you think." He came in. He stood in the center of the space and turned slowly, taking it all in. The firebox, the sealed lengths of channel, Ruth sitting at the small table with her mending. And then he crouched down, without being asked, and pressed his palm flat against the floor, and held it there. He looked up. "It's not warm yet." "No," she said, "not yet. The mountain holds the cold a long time. It gives it up slowly, and it takes back warmth the same way. Slowly. That's the whole secret. Patience is the engine." She showed him the journal. She walked him through the logic of the buried channel, how the smoke traveled down and forward through 40 feet of stone-lined earth, giving up its heat to the rock before it ever reached the far stack, how the rock drank that heat and held it in its mass and let it back up into the room above, slow and steady and sourceless. She used plain words because he was 14. She did not simplify the physics because he gave no sign that he needed her to. He asked good questions, questions that went straight to the places where the system was most complex and most likely to fail. He had his father's instinct for where a thing might break, but he lacked his father's certainty that he already knew the answer. And the absence of that certainty made him a far better listener. He looked at the channel, at the firebox, at the distant stack visible through the unfinished wall, and then he asked the question no one else had asked. "If it works," Wren said slowly, "when does Mr. Voss find out?" Marin looked at him. "He signed the deed without reading the bottom of it," she said. "He doesn't know what he gave away." Wren turned that over. "So when he finds out, what does he do?" Marin looked past him, out through the unfinished wall, down the long slope toward the town. It sat there in its small human way, smoke rising from a dozen chimneys, the thin sound of hammers carrying on the wind. She did not answer. The question hung in the air of the cave, the way smoke hangs for just a moment before the draw pulls it somewhere. Then she picked up her hammer and moved to the next plank, and behind her, after a moment, the boy picked up a trowel. He did not ask permission. He looked at the joint she had been working. He looked at the angle the next stone needed to meet. And he began, quietly, to work. His father had said she would be dead before the snow was gone. His father had not sent him. And his father, she understood, did not yet know that the boy had come back at all. The boy came every day after that. He came without explanation, without ever once mentioning his father. He would appear at the cave mouth in the thin afternoon light, pick up the trowel Marin had set down, and go to work on the section they had left the day before. And Ruth, when she heard him come in, would set an extra cup of tea on the table. She did not look up from her mending. She did not say a word about it. That was all. That was the whole of how Wren Reed became part of the work. They fell into a rhythm, the two of them, the wordless shorthand of people who have been looking at the same problem long enough to talk without talking. He would hold a stone in place, and she would seal it, and neither would need to say why. He had his father's hands. He did not yet have his father's habit of being sure. There were long stretches when neither of them spoke at all. Just the scrape of the trowel, the small wet sound of clay being pressed into a seam, the occasional shift of Ruth's chair behind them. And in those silences, something was being built that had nothing to do with stone. The boy had grown up in a house where his father was always right, where being right was the highest thing a person could be. And here was a place where nobody needed to be right, where you simply did the work and watched what the work did back and let the rock tell you when you had gotten it wrong. It was the first room he had ever been in where he was allowed to not know something. And one afternoon, working close in the dim of the cave, Wren said, without looking up, that his father had known Samuel Hale. Not well, but his father had told him once that Samuel Hale was the only man in that valley who listened to what the ground was actually saying, instead of what he wanted it to say. Myron kept her eyes on the joint. Wren said his father had also said that Samuel Hale dying the way he did was a waste, and that his father did not say that kind of thing lightly. Myron pressed the clay into the seam with her thumb. "No," she said, "he didn't." They worked until the light at the window went orange, but a thing built in secret cannot stay secret in a small place. And down in the town, where the chimneys breathed their thin smoke into the cold, a man was beginning to do arithmetic he did not like. Jonah Reed had told Harlan Voss about the cave. He had not meant it as a betrayal. He had meant it as conversation, the way a builder describes a curiosity over the course of an evening. The strange wall taking shape in the rock, the channel already half-lined with flat stone, the girl who would not be talked out of it. He had told it the way a man tells a thing he finds remarkable and faintly impossible. Voss had listened without expression, and then he had begun to ask questions, each one specific, each one carefully chosen, about the structure of the cave, about the depth of the work, and then, more slowly, about whether, in Jonah Reed's professional judgment, a place like that could be called unsound, unsafe, a danger to two people foolish enough to spend the cold months inside it. Jonah had said he had not done a proper inspection. He had said the cave appeared sound, old, stable rock, no loose stone he could see, no serious water coming through. And Voss had nodded and folded his hands and said the words that mattered. A woman in poor health, a girl, barely grown, a man of Jonah Reed's standing, who had seen the place with his own eyes, might have an obligation to set his concerns down on paper. For their own protection, Jonah had heard the words that were spoken, and on some level he chose not to look at too closely. He had also heard the ones underneath them, but he believed in proper procedure. He believed that structures should be judged by qualified men. He believed his judgment, built over 20 years, carried real weight. So he had said he would write up what he had seen. He said it as a man saying a reasonable thing, not as a man stepping into anything else. He did not understand in that moment that both could be true at once, that a man can do a thing he believes is right and be used by it, and never feel the hand on his back that is guiding him. It was Cora who carried the warning up the slope. She came one gray morning, walking the 2 miles at a pace that meant urgency, while doing its best to look like it did not. She set a cloth sack of provisions on the table without a word, and then she sat down across from Marin, laid her rough hands flat on the wood, and told her what she had come to say. Voss had given Jonah Reed a deadline, 1 week, to set his concerns down formally and bring them to the council. And once that paper was filed, it would trip a provision in the old code, one that let the council order an emergency removal from any structure judged unsafe for people who could not be trusted to know the danger themselves. The language of it covered minors, and it covered persons in poor health. Ruth's cough was known in the town. Marin's age was known. The provision had been written for other purposes in another time, but it fit this the way a key fits a lock it was never cut for, and still turns. Marin looked around the cave, at the sealed floor, at the firebox, finished now, at the wall across the entrance, 3 courses from done. "How long does the wall need?" she asked. Cora said, "That's what I came up here to ask you." Marin was quiet for a moment. 3 days, she said. Cora looked at her a long moment. Then you have a week. She picked up her empty sack and walked back out into the cold. And Marin turned back to the wall and drove the next nail. She did not have her week. She had less, but she did not know that yet. The day after Cora's warning, Ren did not come at his usual hour. He came late in the last of the light, and there was something different in the way he stood at the entrance. He did not pick up the trowel. His father had found out, not from gossip, from the boy himself, who had grown tired of the lie of omission, and had told him plainly, over supper, that he had been spending his days up at the cave, that he had seen what was being built, and that it was not foolishness. Marin learned the shape of what happened next only later, in pieces. But that evening, the sound of it came up the slope ahead of the man, a horse ridden hard, the rhythm of adult urgency, set by something other than a horse's comfort. She came down from the upper course of the wall and set her tools aside. Jonah Reed came through the entrance without knocking, and the expression on his face was not the complicated frown of his first visit, not the quiet deliberation of the man who had stood at the threshold and asked about red thread. This was harder. This was the face of a man who had been made to feel foolish in a way he had not prepared for, and who was working that feeling into anger, because anger was easier to hold than what lay underneath it. He said the boy's name, one flat syllable. Ren stood up from where he had been kneeling by the firebox, and something moved across the boy's face, a brief, complicated negotiation between who he was in this cave and who he was required to be in front of his father. Jonah crossed the space in 3 strides and took him by the arm, the grip of a man who had spent a lifetime building and had never learned to soften his hands for anything that was not timber and stone. He pulled the boy toward the door, and then he stopped at the threshold. He turned back. He looked at the firebox, at the sealed floor, at Marin, who had not moved, who stood there holding a length of iron banding in both hands, watching him with that stillness of hers, and his voice came out flat, final, the sound of a door closing on something that had been left open too long. No son of mine will waste his days on a dead girl's foolishness. The words sat in the cave's air, dead. Ruth set down her mending. She rose from the table, slowly, her body requiring its usual moment of negotiation before it would obey. And she walked to where Jonah Reed stood in the doorway. She stopped in front of him, this man who stood a head taller, who outweighed her by a great deal, who had just used that word about her daughter. And she looked up at his face, without heat, without performance, without anything but the particular clarity that comes to people who have run out of the energy required for anything but the truth. His father, Ruth said, would have listened. 7 words, no accusation in them, no anger, just the truth, set down into the face of a man who knew, even as he heard it, that it was exactly right. Jonah's jaw tightened. He looked at her for a moment with an expression that could not find a comfortable shape to settle into. Then he walked out, with his son, and his boots on the stone floor sounded like a decision being made. And the decision was final. Marin stood and listened to the hoofbeats fade down the slope, until the only sounds left were the wind outside the half-built wall, and the low, steady breath of the system, doing the thing it had been built to do. She looked at the iron banding in her hands. She set it down on the firebox. She did not know what Jonah would choose to do with the paper waiting to be written. She knew only what she had told him was true. The flue was sealed. The firebox was built. The wall needed 3 more days. No document on any kind of letterhead could change what the rock was going to do. She picked up the hammer. She drove the next nail at the correct angle, and she moved to the next plank. But the days that followed were the hardest of all of it, because the system, for the first time, began to fail. She smelled it before she saw anything wrong. A thread of smoke in the cave air, faint enough to dismiss as imagination, except that she did not dismiss things as imagination when the evidence was in front of her. She stood very still and breathed real. It took her the better part of an afternoon to find it, pressing her palm along the sealed floor in slow increments, moving outward from the firebox, feeling for the faint, wrong vibration that meant a leak in the channel below. She found it 11 feet out, a hairline crack in one of the clay joints, opened by a week of the stone heating and cooling. The very failure Jonah Reed had named on his first visit. The exact failure her father had marked as the greatest risk in that stretch of channel. And next to the warning, in the journal, the answer. She marked the spot. And the next morning, Wren came back. He came alone, without explanation, without any acknowledgement of the gap. He simply appeared at the entrance in the way of someone giving the other person room to send him away. She did not send him away. His father had not sent him. And his father, this time, had not forbidden him. The absence of that forbidding was its own kind of statement. Together, they opened a 3-foot section of the sealed floor, lifting the capstones with great care, setting them aside in order so each could go back exactly where it had come from. They exposed the channel beneath. The crack was there in the joint mortar, a clean separation, no wider than a knife blade. Maren mixed a new batch of clay, with more coarse sand in it, a specific change written in her father's hand for exactly this kind of failure under exactly this kind of strain. She sealed the broken joint, and the 2 on either side of it, as a precaution. They repacked the channel, they set the capstones back, and then she told her mother they would not light the fire for 2 days, while the new mortar cured. 2 days without fire. The cave cooled until it matched the air outside, and the air outside had hardened by then into the deep, dry cold of the heart of the season. Ruth's cough came back, not the softer one that had kept them company through the milder weeks, the sharp, tearing one, the one that sounded like something inside her chest was catching on an edge it could not get past. Maren could not fix the cold. She could fix the joint, so she kept working, moving along the other lengths of channel, checking each one by touch, recording what she found. She heated water each morning for her mother's hands. She laid an extra blanket across Ruth's shoulders, and she said nothing about what she was thinking, because what she was thinking was that she had been wrong, that Jonah Reed had predicted this exact failure, and she had told herself she had it handled. And the 2 days of cold her mother was paying for now were the price of her being wrong. She had been wrong in precisely the place he said she would be wrong, and she had fixed it with precisely the answer her father had left her. Both things were true, and neither one erased the other. That was the thing nobody told you about doing a hard thing. That being right and being wrong were not opposite ends of a road, that you could be both on the same morning about the same crack in the same joint. And that the only thing to do with that was to keep your hands moving and let the rock decide. On the morning of the third day, she rebuilt the fire. She waited through the first hour with a controlled, particular anxiety. Then she moved to the repaired section and pressed her palm to the floor and listened with her hand. The wrong vibration was gone. The mortar had held. She rose and walked to the entrance and looked at the distant stack, at the thin, pale wisp of exhaust rising straight up into the still air. Exactly what it should look like. She went back inside and made a note in her records. The failure, the repair, the date the floor came back to warmth. Data gathered before you need it, her father used to say, is the only data that exists at the moment you do. She had never written that down anywhere. She had heard it in his voice enough times that it had become part of the shape of how she thought. And then, when the wall was nearly closed, and the system was holding, and it seemed for a moment that the hardest part might be behind her, the sky did the thing that sky does just before it changes everything. It went perfectly, beautifully clear. The kind of clear that looks permanent. The kind that lets a town tell itself, without ever saying so out loud, that the worst of the season has surely passed. Children were let out early to run on the frozen ground. Men checked their fence lines and shirt sleeves under their coats and called it mild. The cold that morning was sharp. By midday, less so. The light fell golden over a world that seemed, for once, to mean them no harm. And Marin, fitting the last planks into the upper course of the wall, felt the wind change. Not build, change. It had been coming all morning from one direction. And then, between one breath and the next, it came from another. From the shoulder of the mountain. From the high country where the cold lived. It was not a storm yet. It was the pressure that runs ahead of one. The way a thing announces itself before it arrives, if you have learned to feel the announcement. She stopped working. She stood on the slope and looked up at the high ridges, where a gray edge was forming against all that perfect blue, forming fast, eating the clear sky from the top down. And she understood two things at once. The first was that the wall had one course left to close. The second was that she did not have 3 days. She did not have the week Cora had promised her. She had hours. The deadline Voss had set, the paper Jonah Reed had been asked to write, the provision in the old code that fit the lock it was never cut for, none of it mattered now. The mountain had its own arithmetic, and it had just begun to do it. She went down off the wall. She gathered Wren, who had felt the change too, and had already stopped working without being told. They looked at each other. No words. Just the shared understanding of two people reading the same sky. Go home, she said, while you still can see the slope. He looked at the gray edge swallowing the ridge. He looked at the one open course at the top of the wall. He did not go. He picked up the next plank and held it to the gap and said, "Hand me the nails." And so they worked, faster than they had worked on anything. The light beginning to fail, not from the hour, but from the thing climbing down the mountain toward them. The first fine flakes came sideways, not falling so much as driven, stinging where they struck bare skin. Inside, Ruth banked the fire and heated water, and made up the bedrolls, and did the small, steady work of a woman who knew there was no use in fear when there was work to be done. The wall closed. The last plank went in as the world outside went white. Maren drove the final nails at their careful angle and pressed her palms flat against the planks and felt nothing move. Nothing breathed through. Nothing that suggested the cold had found a single seam. And then she turned to the boy. And she understood the second problem. Wren could not go home now. The slope had vanished. The 2 miles between the cave and the town had become a white, roaring nothing, with no up and no down, and no difference between the ground and the sky. To send him into that would be to send him into a thing from which he would not return. "You stay," she said. He nodded. He had known it before she said it. He went to the cave mouth and looked out at the place where the slope had been, where his home was, where his mother and father sat by a fireplace that pulled its air from every gap in the walls, and burned and burned and could not win. And for the first time, the boy looked frightened, not for himself. Maren came and stood beside him. She did not offer comfort she could not back. She only said the truest thing she had. "This place will hold," she said. "The mountain doesn't fight the cold. It already took it in. Weeks ago. It's been holding it for us the whole time. And now it'll give it back." She put her hand flat against the wall. "Feel." He put his hand beside hers. And through the planks, against all the roaring white violence on the other side of them, came the faint, steady warmth of a thing that had been quietly getting ready for this exact hour, long before any of them understood that it would come. Outside, the wind found the wall and threw everything it had against it. And the wall did not answer. It simply held, the way the mountain held, the way her father had said it would. Maren turned from the entrance and went to bank the fire for a long night, and a longer one after it. She did not know yet how many would come knocking at that wall before it was over. She only knew that when they did, the door would open. The storm did not pass in a night. It settled in, the way some things settle in. As though it had decided this slope, this valley, this stretch of cold country was where it meant to stay a while. And the town below learned, hour by hour, what it had told itself was not coming. The fireplaces that Jonah Reed had built over 20 years, the wide, handsome hearths that were the pride of the better homes, became, in a wind like this, engines of their own undoing, because every fire needs air to burn, and every fire in an open hearth pulls that air from somewhere. And in a sealed house, in a cold that pressed against the walls like a living thing, the air came in through every gap and every seam, cold, and had to be warmed from nothing before it could do any good. And then it was gone up the chimney and replaced by more cold air, in a cycle that had no bottom. The fires blazed at the centers of the rooms, and the rooms froze at their edges, and the distance between those two things grew smaller by the hour. The wood went in stages. First the families who had come into the cold least prepared, then the families who had prepared sensibly, for a sensible season, and by the second day, Even the households that prided themselves on being ready were looking at what was left of their wood piles, and beginning to understand that this was not a season their readiness had been measured against. Furniture went into the fire. Fence posts were pulled and split. A man on the edge of town took the doors off his own barn, and people began moving toward the meeting hall, drawing together, sharing what little warmth could be shared. In the particular quiet of people who have stopped spending thought on anything past the next hour. In that crowded hall, a man who had spent the autumn at Cora's counter making remarks about the Hale girl in her cave sat against the wall with his arms crossed and stared at a window that showed nothing but white. After a while, he said, to no one in particular, that if the thing in that cave actually worked, he wondered whether the women up there would take anyone in. Cora was sitting 3 feet from him. "I don't know," she said, "but I know she won't ask you first what you said about her before she answers." The man did not respond to that. Cora looked back at the window. She thought about the rope and the lamp oil she had carried up the slope. She thought about her own husband, gone underground in a place she still could not name, and she thought about the particular loneliness of understanding a thing about the world that no one around you is willing to hear. She thought that the Hale girl had understood that loneliness very young, and had never once let it turn her hard. Up at the cave, the warmth held. Marin fed the firebox small loads, nothing wasted, and the system took what it was given and gave it back, with the patient honesty of a thing built correctly. The floor was warm at every point along its length. Ruth sat at the table without her shawl. Wren slept, when he could, on the warmest stone, and woke and looked toward the wall that hid the slope where his home was, and said nothing. On the gray morning of the storm's second day, the first knock came. It was almost lost in the roar, a flat, dead sound against the planks, the kind of sound a man's fist makes when even the air has gone too cold to carry it well. Marin opened the door, and Jonah Reed stood in the white. He was not the man who had ridden up that slope twice to tell her she would die. He was barely a man at all in that first moment. He was a shape made of snow and cold, and something past exhaustion. His coat was rimed white. His face was the wrong color. And his eyes, when they found hers, held nothing of the certainty that had ridden up that slope before. He had carried something on his back. A boy, not Wren. Wren was inside, already rising from the warm floor, already crossing toward the door with a sound caught in his throat. This was a smaller child, a neighbor's boy, perhaps 8, limp, quiet in the way children go quiet when the cold has gone past the part of them that complains. Jonah Reed had walked 2 miles through a thing no sane man walks through, carrying a child who was not his own, to the door of a cave he had twice told this girl would be her grave. He could not speak at first. Marin did not wait for him to. She took the child from his back and carried him to the warmest stretch of the floor and laid him down and began the work she had become very good at without ever meaning to, reading a body for how much cold it had taken in, how much it could still give back. Jonah came through the door behind her, and he stopped. He stood in the center of the cave he had condemned, and he felt it, not the blast of an open hearth, not heat that came from one place that you had to stand near to receive. This was something else, warmth that came from everywhere at once, from the floor under his feet, from the walls, from the very air. A steady, sourceless warmth, with no peaks and no edges, that did not ask him to stand in any particular place to be warm. He pulled off his gloves. His hands were white, the skin cracked across the knuckles, from 2 days of a cold that had gone past what skin is built to bear. And he looked at the floor, and then he knelt. This big man who built things, who had been certain for 20 years. He knelt down on the stone she had laid, and he pressed both palms flat against it. And what came up into his hands was not the warmth of something recently heated. It was the warmth of something that had been right for a long time, quietly, without asking to be noticed, waiting with the patience of stone, for the hour when being right and being needed would finally arrive at the same place. It moved through him the way warmth moves into very cold things, finding the outer layers first, each one reluctant, and then yielding. He knelt there with his hands against her father's design, against stone that had been charged over weeks with the slow output of a system a dead man had drawn in this exact place, years before either of them understood why it would ever matter. He did not speak. He was not capable of speech equal to the moment. He looked up at her, and Marin met his eyes, and held them. He nodded, once, slowly, a movement that contained the whole accounting, the condemnation he had nearly signed, the word dead he had said in this room, the certainty he had carried up this slope and would not be carrying back down. She nodded back, and then he found his voice, wrecked as it was. "My boy," he said, "Ren's mother. They're still in the house. We've got nothing left to burn. I came for the little one first. He was the worst." Marin was already moving. She went to the woodpile and took an armful. She took the small sled from against the wall. She went to the food and measured out half of what remained and wrapped it. She handed Jonah the sled rope, without hesitation, without any visible calculation of what she was giving away or what it would cost her if more came knocking than she had planned for. "Stay to the right of the slope," she said, "where the rock shoulder breaks the worst of it. Take this wood, build a fire in your house just long enough to get them strong enough to move. Then bring them here, all of them." He stood holding the rope and looked at the wood on the sled. He had said in this cave to her face that no son of his would waste his days on a dead girl's foolishness, and the foolishness was about to keep his son's mother alive through the night, and the little one breathing on the warm floor behind her, and himself. He did not try to say any of that. He took the rope, and he walked back into the white. The hours after that ran together. The little one came back slowly, his color drained from gray to something living. His breathing deepened. Ren sat beside him with one hand on the small chest, feeling it rise and fall, saying nothing. And Ruth moved through it all with a quiet competence Marin had not seen in her since before the worst of the coughing years. She made the bedrolls go further than bedrolls should. She set water to heat. She found, somewhere inside the careful economy of their nearly empty stores, enough to put something warm in front of a frightened child. It was as though the warmth of the place had given her back something the cold had been slowly taking. Jonah returned in the deep of that night. He came with his wife, a thin, steady woman named Della, and with Ren's older sister, and with the strength gone almost entirely out of him. He had built a fire in his own house with Marin's wood, and warmed them enough to move, and then walked them up through the storm with a rope around his waist and the other end around theirs, so the white could not take one of them without taking them all. They came through the door, and the warmth took them. Della stood in the center of the cave and turned slowly, the way they all turned, the first time, taking in the floor, the firebox, the impossible steady heat. And then she looked at the girl who had built it, and something passed over her face that was too large to be only gratitude. She crossed the space, and she took Marin's hands in both of hers, the cracked ones, the calloused ones, and she held them for a moment, not long enough to require an answer, not short enough to be an accident. Then she let go and went to her son, and the door knocked again. The second family came near dawn, the Hollis family. A man, a woman, 2 small children, and nothing but the clothes they stood in, and the blank, scoured look of people who have stopped thinking past the next 5 minutes. Marin made room. Ruth shifted her own bedroll without a word. The 2 small children sat down on the warm floor and pressed their palms flat against it, the way the boy had, the way they all did, with the silent wonder of small people who have just learned a thing about the world that they will carry the rest of their lives without ever quite being able to say what it is. The food was counted again. It was enough, barely. The kind of enough that does not invite discussion, because discussion would only make the thinness of it more present than it needed to be. And still, the storm did not pass. By the 3rd day, the cave held more people than its builder had ever pictured warming. And the strange thing, the thing none of them spoke of, but all of them felt, was that there was no panic in it, no clawing. The warmth seemed to reach something in people past their fear. They sat. They breathed. They watched the children sleep on the floor of a mountain that was, against everything they had been raised to believe, keeping them alive. And then, on the morning of that 3rd day, with the wind finally beginning to tire, dropping from its full roar to something merely fierce, a figure appeared at the cave mouth, alone. Marin opened the door, and Harlan Voss stood in the white. He was carrying a child, a small girl, 6 years old perhaps, his own kin, a niece, the daughter of a sister who had come to the valley not long before. The sister was below, sheltering in the crowded hall with a hurt ankle that had made the climb impossible. And so the child's safety had fallen to the man who held her now. The girl had gone quiet, that same terrible quiet, past the point where cold seems worth complaining about, and Harlan Voss had understood what that quiet meant. So he had put on everything he owned, and he had walked 2 miles through a storm that had already beaten stronger men than him, to the door of a place he had handed away as worthless, to the daughter of a man he had buried with a cruelty he had not been able to keep behind his teeth. He stood in the doorway with the child in his arms, and on his face was the full weight of the walk, and behind that, visible to anyone who looked, the weight of everything that had come before it. A man who had signed a paper without reading the bottom of it. A man who had used another man's good standing as a tool, without that man's full understanding of what he was being made into. A man who had looked at a girl with her father's knowledge in her hands and seen foolishness where there was something close to genius. A man who had handed 2 women a death and called it charity and gone home satisfied with his own kindness. It was all there in his face at once, and none of it was spoken. Marin looked at him. Then she looked at the child, and she did the only thing there was to do. She took the girl from his arms and carried her to the warmest stone and laid her down and pressed her palm to the small cold cheek and read what she found there with the calm of someone who had spent a season learning the exact difference between enough warmth and not enough, cold, but not past returning, present, coming back. Voss stood in the doorway, and Ruth Hale, without looking up from the pot she was tending, without changing the rhythm of what her hands were doing, said, "Close the door. You're letting the cold in." That was all. 6 words. Not forgiveness, not yet, and maybe not ever in the full sense of the word, but something. The simple, enormous act of letting a man who had tried to put you out in the cold come in out of it. Voss stepped inside. He closed the door, and he stood in the warmth of the cave and looked at the people gathered there, the Reeds, the Hollis children, the neighbor's boy, breathing easy now, his own niece, color already returning to her face. All of them alive in a place these 2 women had made livable through weeks of labor and a faith the town had been so quick to call grief turned strange. He found a place against the wall near the entrance, and he sat down, and he did not speak. He was a man who had spent a lifetime knowing when to speak, and he understood, perhaps for the first time, that there was nothing here that words could improve. An hour behind him, the door knocked once more. Deputy Boone. He had followed the tracks up the slope. He stood at the threshold and looked into the cave, and saw what was inside it. He saw Voss sitting in the corner. He saw the children on the warm floor. He saw the girl moving among them, checking the firebox with the same focused attention she gave it whether anyone watched or not. And Boone reached into his coat, and he took out the small notebook, the one he had carried since the cold first came, the one in which he had written down everything he had been told to write down, the offer of the storage shed and her answer to it, her trips up the slope, who came to the cave, and when, and for how long. He looked at it a moment in his cold, stiff hands, and then he set it on the shelf beside the door. He did not hand it to her. He did not explain it. He simply set it down and stepped inside and found a place to sit and stayed there until the storm broke. A man can spend a long time being an instrument in someone else's hand, and then one day he sets the thing down, and the setting down says everything the man cannot. That night, Jonah Reed sat against the wall and did not sleep. He watched his son breathe. He watched the rise and fall of the small chest of a child who was not his own. He watched Della's face soften toward something like rest, and he looked at the cave around him and let himself understand it, fully, without the shelter of a single remaining qualification. The distance between what he had been so sure of and what was true. At some point in the dark, he rose quietly and crossed to where Marin sat near the firebox, keeping her watch over it. He did not sit. He stood for a moment, looking down at the small, steady bed of coals that was warming a room full of people through the worst night any of them had known. "Your father," he said, low so as not to wake the children. "He drew this whole thing, years back, In here. Yes, she said. And you built it. He shook his head slowly. A man spends 20 years certain he knows how warmth works in this country. And it turns out, he never once thought to ask the mountain. Marin was quiet a moment. He didn't think to ask, she said, because the mountain doesn't answer fast. You build a fire and you want the room warm now. You stand by it and it warms you now. My father used to say, that's the trap. The fire that warms you fast spends everything it has and leaves you cold the moment it goes out. She fed a single stick to the coals. The mountain doesn't do that. You give it warmth slow, and it gives it back slow. You can't hurry it. You can't trick it. You can only be patient and be steady and trust that what you put in is being held somewhere you can't see until you need it. Jonah looked at her for a long moment. That's not just stone you're talking about, he said. No, she said. It isn't. He nodded, and he went back to the wall and sat down beside his sleeping son, and at some point, near morning, he finally slept. The storm broke on the fourth morning. It did not break gently. It simply stopped. The roar that had filled their ears for days fell away between one moment and the next, leaving a silence so complete it had a weight to it. And when Marin opened the door, the world outside was a thing remade. The slope had been rearranged, familiar shapes buried, new shapes raised, and over all of it, a sky so clear and hard and blue, it looked almost like an accusation. The light fell down without warmth, gilding a landscape that had nearly taken every soul now sheltered behind her. The people in the cave woke slowly and took it in, and one by one they understood that they had lived, that a girl of 17 and her ailing mother on a patch of ground the whole valley had agreed was worthless, had pulled them through a thing that should have taken some of them, and had not asked a single one of them, on the way in, what they had said about her before. That was the part that would stay with them longest, not the warmth. The warmth they would explain to themselves, in time, in the language of stone and air and the cleverness of a dead miner's drawing. But the open door they would never quite be able to explain. The Hollis children went out first with their parents, walking and sometimes sliding down the cleared stretches of slope on the soles of their boots, their father watching without a word. The neighbor's boy walked between Jonah and Della, holding a hand on each side, and Harlan Voss carried his niece for the first stretch of the way down, until she woke fully, and in the imperious way of a 6-year-old who has decided she is done being carried, demanded to be set down. He set her down, and he walked beside her, with his hand near her, not insisting on it. He paused once at the place where the slope began to fall away toward the town, and he turned and looked back up at the cave, at the mismatched planks of the wall set into the ancient rock, at the thin pale thread of smoke rising straight and steady from the distant stack into the still, cold air. He did not say anything. A man like that does not yet have the words. They would come to him later, some of them. He turned and went down after the child. Jonah Reed was the last to leave. He stood with his family already started down the path, and he looked back at the girl standing in the cave mouth with her arms crossed against the cold. "I'd like to build it properly," he said. "The wall, the firebox. Come the warm months, when the ground will work. I have the lumber. and I know how to put my hands to stone differently than I did a week ago." A pause. That held its own full accounting. "I'd like to build it the way it deserves." Marin was quiet for a moment, not hesitating, considering, which is a different thing. "In the spring," she said, "when the ground is workable." She looked down the long white slope toward the town that had tried to put her on it, and had then come climbing up it, one frozen soul at a time, to be saved. "There are other families in this valley," she said, "who'll need to know how this works, not just to be warm, to never have to beg anyone for it." Jonah heard the whole of what was underneath that. He had read her father's letter in her face without ever seeing the page. "I've been building here 20 years, he said. "I know how to carry a thing from one man's hands to the next. If you'll teach me the whole of it, I can carry it further than either of us could carry it alone." The offer stood in the cold morning air between them. It was not a simple thing he was offering. It held the paper he had nearly signed, the boy he had called a waste, the 7 words Ruth had said into his face, and the long night on the floor, with his hands against the stone. Marin understood all of it. She did not make him say it. "Come in the spring," she said, "and bring Wren." He nodded. The same slow nod he had given her in the gray light after the storm. And he turned and went down the slope after his family. Marin stood in the cave mouth a while longer, watching them go. Small figures, dark against all that white, making their careful way down toward the chimneys that had failed them. Behind her, the cave was quiet again. Just her mother, and the steady breath of the system, and the warmth that did not ask to be noticed. She put her hand against the wall. The stone was warm. It had been warm the whole time. The town that came down off that slope was not quite the same town that had climbed it. The change was small at first, the kind of change you have to watch for. People who had passed Marin Hale on the street without a word now nodded when they saw her. Not much. A tilt of the head, but a nod is a small surrender, and surrenders accumulate. The story moved through the valley the way stories move through small places. Not all at once, in pieces, around stoves, over counters, the girl, the cave. The night the worst cold anyone could remember came down off the mountain, and a place everyone had called worthless turned out to be the only warm ground for 2 miles in any direction. And the open door. The part nobody could quite explain was always the part they came back to. The weeks after the storm were lean ones for everybody. Wood piles had been burned to nothing. Furniture had gone up the chimney. The whole valley spent the back end of the cold season putting itself slowly back together, board by board and meal by meal. And up at the cave, the warmth held. It had never stopped holding. Through the storm, through the lean weeks after, through the long gray stretch when the season could not seem to decide whether it was leaving. Marin fed the firebox its small, steady loads. Ruth sat without her shawl. And the stone gave back, day after day, exactly what it had been given. It was perhaps 3 weeks after the storm that Harlan Voss came up the slope alone. He came without money. That was the first surprising thing. Money had been his first instinct. The way money was his first instinct about everything. He had sat in his big house with a fire that pulled cold air through every wall, and he had thought about what a man in his position does to settle a debt of this size, and then he had put the money away. because he had understood, somewhere in the long nights after the storm, that this was not a debt money could touch. He sat across from Marin at the small table, in the chair that had become, without anyone deciding it, the visitor's chair, the one people sat in when they came to learn something, and he said what he had come to say. The deed stood. The land was hers, free and clear, all its clauses intact. He had gone home and read his own paper, more carefully than he had read it the day he signed it, and he understood the clause at the bottom now, the one about the mineral rights, the one he had not bothered to read, because no man reads carefully the fine print of a thing he is certain has no worth. He acknowledged it as hers, without qualification. Then he laid out what he could offer: capital, materials, the men who moved goods through the country, the reach to build at a scale no person could manage with hand tools and a winter's worth of supplies. Marin listened to all of it, and then she declined the payment he offered for the right to the design. She declined the share of future earnings. She looked down at her own hands on the table, the healed cracks, the calluses in their places, and she waited. Voss was a man who had spent 30 years knowing exactly when to leave a negotiation. He stood in the posture of that knowing. She did not move. She did not adjust her face. He looked at the firebox. He looked at the floor. And he sat back down. This was not how he had done business for 30 years. But he thought about the child he had carried up that slope. He thought about the color coming back into her small face within an hour of crossing this threshold. He thought about what he had tried in his careful and indirect way to prevent the woman across the table from building. The rights stay with you, he said, not a concession, a statement of fact. Yes, Marin said, and the system gets built in every home in this valley that needs it, at cost, no margin above the materials. He sat with that a long moment. It went against every instinct he had spent a lifetime sharpening. He thought again of the child. Agreed, he said, and Ren Reed learns the whole of it. You don't interfere with that. Something shifted in his expression. Not resistance, not quite acceptance. Something working its way toward a shape. He earned that, Voss said. The first day he walked up here. I understand that now. And then he was quiet for a moment, looking at his hands. And he said one more thing. A thing she had not asked for and had not expected. The first week you were up here, he said, your tools, the drawing you lost, the one that came back to you in pieces. He did not look away from her when he said it. That was a man of mine, on a small horse. I sent him to see what you were building, and then I sent him back to stop it. The cave was very still. I told myself it was nothing, Voss went on. A scrap of paper. I told myself a girl who could lose a drawing in the night could be talked off that ground by spring without anyone getting hurt. A long breath. I did not understand then that the drawing was never the thing. That you had it somewhere a man on a horse could never reach. Marin looked at him. She had wondered through the whole long season who had torn it, and now she knew. And the knowing did not bring the heat she might once have expected. It brought instead a strange quiet, the quiet of a question that has finally been allowed to set itself down. No, she said. You didn't understand it. Neither did I until the morning after. I learned something that night that you couldn't have taken from me with 100 men on 100 horses. "What's that?" Voss said. "That the most important thing my father left me," she said. "He never wrote on any page." Voss held her eyes a moment longer. Then he nodded, slowly. The way a man nods when an account he has carried a long time is finally fully balanced. And then he did one last thing she had not expected. He reached into his coat and set something on the table between them. Boone's notebook, the small one, the one the deputy had set on the shelf by the door the morning the storm broke. Marin had wondered in the weeks since where it had gone. Boone, it turned out, had carried it back down the slope when he left, and given it to the man who had asked him to keep it. And that man was now setting it down on her table. "I asked him to keep that," Voss said. "I thought it would be useful. In one way." A pause. It turned out to be useful in a different one. Marin looked at the notebook. She did not open it. She did not need to. She understood what it had been meant for, and she understood, looking at the man who had set it down, what it had become instead. A record of everything she had done, begun as evidence against her, ending as testimony to her. "I know," she said. Voss nodded once, and he rose and went out and rode down the slope toward the town. And he did not look back. The spring came the way it always came to that country, reluctant at first, and then all at once. The snow pulled back from the lower slopes. The frozen creek woke up and ran loud. The stubborn juniper on the scree above the cave put out its first tentative green. The same juniper that had stood there, unchanged and uncaring, the morning Marin first climbed up to read the ground with her father's eyes. And Jonah Reed came, as he had said he would. He came with Wren, who was an inch taller than he had been in the cold, and with 2 other builders, men who had spent the long season turning over, in their minds, what the storm had taught them about the edges of what they thought they knew. They stood in the cave, and Marin explained the whole of it, not as theory, as behavior, as the thing stone does when you ask it correctly. She showed them the tolerances that mattered and the ones that had a little room, the ways it could fail and the signs of each failing and the answer to each one. Most of them in her father's hand, a few now in her own. And Jonah Reed asked the questions of a man learning, which is a rarer thing than it sounds, the questions of a man who has set down the weight of what he was already sure of, in order to take up something new. It was harder for him than the work itself. She could see it. A man does not unlearn 20 years of certainty without it costing him something. But he paid the cost, without complaint. And Wren stood at his father's shoulder and asked his own questions. Sharper in some places, more patient in others. When one of the 2 builders looked at the channel, drawing with the doubt of a man trained his whole life on chimneys that pull upward. It was Wren who walked him through the logic of it, slow and clear, until the doubt turned into something useful. Cora was there. No one had invited her. No one was surprised to see her. When the lesson wound down, and the 2 builders were talking to each other in the language of a thing they had not understood that morning, Cora came and stood beside Marin, and watched the men with their notebooks and their drawings. "Your father would have liked watching this," she said quietly. Marin looked at the men, at her father's design moving out of one cave and into the hands of people who would carry it across a whole valley. "He did watch it," she said, "years ago, alone in here, with his lamp. before any of them knew what it was going to mean. The work spread through that valley the way warmth spreads through stone, slow, and then everywhere. By the heart of summer, 3 homes had been rebuilt around the buried channel. By the next cold season, a handful more, each one different, each one asking its own questions of its own ground, its own rock, its own slope, and each one answered with the same principle underneath the differences. You build to the conditions that are, not the ones you wish were. The name formed the way names form in small places, not by anyone deciding it, by repetition. The same words used often enough, by enough people, until they stopped being description and became the thing's name. They called it the Hale system. No one argued, because the name was true in both of its meanings. It was the work of a girl named Hale, and it was the work of the man whose name she carried, the man who had drawn it years before in the dark, and tied a red thread around the page, and trusted that the right hands would find it when the time came. And here is the thing that made it more than a story about warm stone. The promise Maren had drawn from Voss, that the system would be built at cost in every home that needed it, held. No family in that valley ever again had to choose between warmth and the rest of what a life requires. No man ever again held the cold over another man and named his price. The thing Samuel Hale had refused to sell all those years before, the thing he had said no person should be allowed to own over others, became in the end exactly what he had wanted it to be. Not a fortune, not a name on a building, a thing the valley simply had now, the way it had the creek and the ridge and the long blue evenings. Free. Voss kept his word in his quiet way. He paid for the first several rebuildings out of his own pocket, without announcement, without his name attached to any of it. The families who received them never knew where the materials came from. Maren knew. She never said. It was not the kind of thing that needed saying. And Jonah Reed. Jonah gave her the full credit in every conversation, with every builder he ever worked beside, precise about where the knowing had begun and with whom. He had improved the firebox himself in 2 real ways, and he was honest about that too. But he was just as honest about what had come before his improvements, and who had made them possible. It was the most honest thing he knew how to do. And after a while, it stopped being a choice, and simply became the way he was. The years moved over the valley the way years do. Ruth Hale lived a long time after that cold season. A long time. The cough that had been her companion through the worst years did not come back in any serious way. The thing that had been slowly closing inside her chest, winter after damp winter. It eased in the steady, even warmth of the cave, until it was no longer the thing that shaped her days. She grew old in that place. Properly old. The kind of old that is a gift, and not a sentence. And when her time finally came, it came in the warm room that the cave had become, with the smell of old stone and clean fire around her, and her daughter's hand in hers. Her shawl was folded on a chair nearby. It had not been worn indoors in many years. She did not die fighting the cold. She died warm, in the full and simple meaning of the word, in a place built by her own daughter's hands to hold what it was given. Maren stayed in the valley. She became, in the way that people who hold something essential become, the one others came to when the essential questions needed answering. Not a figure on a platform, a working woman, quiet and exact, and possessed of the rare gift of being able to sit still enough to hear what a material was trying to tell her. She taught. That was the heart of it in the end. She taught Wren Reed, who became, in time, the finest builder that Valley would ever know. And Wren taught others. And the others taught others still. And the red thread on her father's journal grew thin from many hands turning to that page. But it held. It always held. She never married, and she never seemed to feel the lack of it. The work was a kind of company. The valley was a kind of family. And the cave, with its steady, sourceless warmth, was a kind of conversation that never ended. Between a daughter and the father who had left her away to live, folded thin in the seam of a leather book. She read his letter again, sometimes, on the long evenings, the one about the man who had wanted to own warmth, and the no he had given him. And every time she read it, she understood it a little differently, because she was, in some small way, a different reader each time. The page had not changed. She had. That was the thing about the deepest truths, she came to think. They did not change to meet you. You changed, slowly, until you were finally large enough to meet them. One winter evening, many years on, after the last student of the season had gone home down the slope, Maren sat alone at the table. She was not young anymore. Her own hands had grown into the rough, capable hands of a woman who had spent a life putting them to good use. The cracks of that first hard season were long healed, gone pale into the larger map of everything that had come after. The cave was a home now, in every way that mattered. A real door, a second window, rooms that had been added over the years. But the firebox was the same. The buried channel was the same. And the journal still sat on the table, open to the marked page, where any person who came to learn would read it before anything else was explained. Outside, snow was falling. Not driven, not violent, just falling, slow and vertical and windless. The way snow falls when the world means no harm by it. Visible through the window as a soft descent into the blue dark. She watched it for a while, and she thought, the way the old think on quiet nights, about all of it. The step outside the town hall, the folded paper held out like a kindness, the word her mother had nearly said, and the small pressure of a hand that had stopped her, the red thread, the torn diagram, drawn again from the place no one could reach. The first wisp of smoke pulled down into the floor instead of up. The night the door kept opening. She thought about a man kneeling on her father's stone with his cracked hands flat against it, unable to speak. She thought about 6 words spoken into a doorway. Close the door. You're letting the cold in. And she thought about the thing she had come to understand, slowly, over all the years between that girl on the step and this woman at the table. The valley remembered her as the one who had been wronged, and had answered the wrong with warmth instead of with cold. And that was true, as far as it went. But she had come to think the truer thing was smaller and quieter. She had not, in the end, defeated anyone. She had not beaten Harlan Voss. She had not triumphed over the men in the town hall, or proven Jonah Reed wrong, or won. Those words had never quite fit what happened. The mountain does not defeat the cold. It does not beat the winter. It simply takes the cold in, and holds it, and waits. and on the other side of the waiting gives back warmth. That was the whole of it. She had been given something hard, a grief, and a wrong, and a patch of worthless ground, and she had not fought it. She had taken it in and held it and waited. And on the far side of the waiting, somehow, it had all come back as warmth for her mother, for a frightened boy, for a town that had not deserved it and had been given it anyway. She closed the journal. She left it on the table, the red thread marking the page, holding the place as it had held it for more years than she could easily count. She would open it again in the morning. Someone would come. Someone always came. The fire in the firebox was banked load of coals. It would want feeding in the morning. It would want feeding every morning. Because that was the nature of the arrangement, and always had been. You give the mountain something first, and then, in its own slow time, it gives back. Not the way a quick fire gives, all at once and gone, but steadily, faithfully, long after the hand that built the fire has gone still. The floor beneath her feet was warm. It had been warm, without interruption, for longer than some of the children in that valley had been alive. Marin sat a while longer in the quiet. An old woman in a warm room she had built out of a thing the whole world had called worthless. And she did not feel triumphant. She had never, not once in all the years, felt triumphant. She felt something better than that. She felt at peace. Outside, the snow kept falling, slow, straight down, unhurried, and the mountain took it in, the way it took everything in, without complaint, without hurry, without any need to understand that what it was doing was, for so many people, the difference between a hard life and a warm one. It did not need to understand. It never had. It simply held what it was given and gave it back.